Welcome, BookTube. Welcome to the History Shelf for another author interview. I am so tickled today to introduce Brian Bruce. Many of you out there know Brian as Bookish. Has his own YouTube channel for many years now. And Brian, welcome to our author interview.
Thank
We
you.
are, in case many of you didn't know, Brian wrote a book, and that is MacArthur's Bloody Butchers, Company G, 163rd Infantry Regiment in the Pacific War, and it's put out by Casemate Publishers. And we're going to be diving into this book today. I just recently finished reading it, loved it, learned a lot of new things, Brian. So,
Oh.
yeah, I was so tickled. There's a funny story about this that I featured this book in one of my recent, new military history books. And I wouldn't have known that it was Brian at Bookish's book, and unless, until he had pointed it out to me in a comment. And I was like, got to get you on the show.
I was so excited to see my book on your channel. I just wanted to say, hey, it was so great. So it was a really great author moment for me.
Oh,
So
well, thank you. And I was so tickled. I was like, wow, we got to get Brian on the show because I'm trying to do more author interviews. And so thank you for taking time today
oh, thank you.
to talk about it. So, yeah, for anyone who's kind of new to you, if you just want to give a little brief introduction
Sure.
of yourself.
So my name is Brian Bruce. I was a history teacher for 31 years, high school, community college teacher. Did kind of since then and during that time, I guess I call myself an amateur historian, researching, writing about various product projects, writing on various projects. I published a book many years ago now, called Thomas Boyd, Lost Author of the Lost Generation, which was about a 1920s author who had been a Marine during World War I and wrote about his experiences. And then this project to write this book about MacArthur's Bloody Butchers came to me through kind of a family connection that I have to one of the men who's featured in the book. And it just kind of like evolved from there into a bigger book, a slightly bigger book.
A slightly bigger book. Yeah, and then the first book, I wasn't aware of the first book you've written. Is that in print or is that available?
It's still in print. It was published by the University of Akron Press, and as far as I know, they have not taken it out of print. The last time I checked their website, though, when you tried to click on it to buy it, it said the page didn't exist. So
Oh no.
I don't know. You can get it. You might be able to get it in a library.
Hmm.
It's in a lot of university libraries. It was kind of one of those books, a university press book, and it probably sold more copies to libraries than it sold to
Okay.
just general readers. But you could probably try, and you could probably find a used copy
Okay.
out there.
It sounds interesting. World War One is another interest of mine, and I love just learning about the soldier experience. Um, so
Right.
yeah, so
Well,
I'll check that out.
he wrote a novel called Through the Wheat, which is probably the best American novel dealing with what American soldiers went through during World War One. At least in my opinion, it is.
Fantastic. Well, thank you.
Mhm.
Note to all the viewers out there, I'll be looking for that. So
That is widely available.
that one is, and but also going to look for your other book as well.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so the family aspect, that was one of the first questions, and you touch on that in the introduction.
Mhm.
So, having read it, but for our viewers who are watching, can you just speak on your great uncle
Sure.
Doyle?
Sure. My great uncle Doyle was a member of Company G who fought in the Pacific, really from 1943 through almost the very end of the war in 1945. He was my grandfather's brother, his only brother, and he was probably the second most important man in my father's life. My father worked for him. Michael Doyle was a brick mason after the war. My father worked for him for a long time and admired him. And Uncle Doyle had a reputation for toughness that was legendary in the family. And I had no idea where that came from because for whatever reason, I didn't know that he was a World War II veteran until I was in high school or college and a story came out in the local newspaper about him. And then, from then on, whenever I saw him, it really wasn't a time to talk about it. And he'd never talked about it before, so it didn't feel like something I should bring up. But fortunately, years after he died, my father had a videotape of him giving an interview to another family member about his experiences in World War II and as a member of Company G. And I watched that and I was so struck by how honest and open and direct he was and how the stories were still, really vivid in his imagination, and
Yeah.
how willing he was to share these stories, which were, I thought, pretty remarkable, and I had had no, idea about before. So I thought, well, I'll write something about my uncle. And I wrote an article which I tried to get into a local historical journal,
Mhm.
uh, in part because I knew it would make my dad happy. And then I thought, well, I should try to write a book about my Uncle Doyle. Well, if you ever, you can't write a book based on one videotape interview, even though it's 45 minutes long. And so that kind of fell apart. But over time, I developed this idea of doing more research on Company G and maybe writing like a unit history, which is kind of where this comes out. And I know the title, if I were a general reader and I weren't interested in military history, the title after the, colon would be off-putting. Company G,
Yeah.
163rd Infantry Regiment in the Pacific War. That sounds awfully military history heavy.
Yeah.
And what I hope to achieve in the book was kind of a blending, like where the military history is there, but really I think of it more as a story of the four men, my uncle being one of them, who are kind of at the heart of the story and their experiences and their stories.
Yes, and that does come across. I've read a lot of military history and a lot of casemate publisher titles, and so yeah, a lot of times those books can be really technical, but I found yours was just a joy to read. Like I was telling you earlier, I just you kind of write with a flair like Ulysses Grant, just straightforward, and you don't get too bogged down in the technical stuff. It was really easy for me to kind of understand like troop movements and
Mhm.
actually how the different units would alternate.
Right.
That was fascinating to me. So let me just let
Well,
everyone
thank you.
know. Yeah, don't let the subtitle draw. This is a really great book. And so on that note, how did you choose the other three members that the narrative revolved around?
Well, two of them were really easy to pick because they wrote about the war themselves. They wrote their own stories. One of the other men is a man named Jack Anderson, who eventually was appointed to lieutenant during the war. And he wrote a book after the war, many years after the war, like in the 90s, I think, which is the basis for his story. And it talks about his military service in World War II and in Korea, because he
Oh.
served in both
Mhm.
conflicts. So, the World War II part of this story, my uncle's name is actually in there. They were friends. They did things together, not just in the military, but, when they were on R&R. And so that was a natural bridge to that person. And then Company G, 163rd Infantry, is part of the 41st Infantry Division. And one of the members of Company G was a man named Hargis Westerfield, who went on to get a PhD in, I want to say literature, and he taught at the University of Nebraska at Kearney
Oh
for a
yeah.
while.
Okay.
And but he kind of appointed himself the division historian, and he wrote literally, I mean, I'm not joking here, hundreds of like journal newspaper style articles based on his experiences, but pretty much every part of the 41st Infantry Division he wrote about. So they're quartermaster things and artillery groups. He talks about their actions. But since he was a part of Company G, there's a fair amount of his experience in Company G as well. And he was a draftee who joined after the initial combat experience of Company G in New
Mhm.
Guinea. And the fourth person I found through the National Archives,
Okay.
just trying to find one more member of Company G whose story I could get access to. And I found it that way because they had the World War II project, which is just an incredibly great resource in all kinds of ways. And so I found Bruce Baird. He's the fourth member. He's the
Mhm.
member who was with kind of the company the shortest because he was wounded and then became ill and
Yeah.
got rotated back to the United States.
Yeah.
So they're kind of overlapping. The two men who were in it the entire time are my uncle and Jack Anderson.
And Jack Anderson. Yeah. And it's interesting. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you
It's
kind
okay.
of towards the end, Jack Anderson is one of the guys who was in Hiroshima
Yep.
and was able to witness the after, effects of that.
He was, and that was he had actually transferred out of the company G of the 163rd, and he became part of Company G of the 186th.
Right.
He was still a part of the 41st, and he was stationed very near Hiroshima as part of the Army of Occupation, and he was actually in charge of trying to find routes where they could transport stuff from one place to another, and those went through Hiroshima, and so
Mhm.
he spent time there, as did a lot of the other members of Company G as well.
Wow.
So it's a lot of it's based on primary sources for the most part, but
Mhm.
primary sources I found
Yeah.
from the men who'd actually written about it and published it themselves.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to talk about the research aspect of it could you, that makes a nice segue into that. Because I noticed like you have a bibliography of the main sources that you use. But can you tell us a little bit about just the research you did? And let me preface that by saying, have you had an interest in World War II history? Or is this kind of new once you found out about your great uncle? Or
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a clear answer. What I would say is that my interest in history started probably like a lot of boys' interest in history started. I was interested in wars and military things. My dad was a huge Civil War amateur historian, knows so much, read so much
yeah.
about the Civil War, and so I had those books. And then I loved World War II movies when I was a kid, and so that created some interest. But when I grew up, World War One was really more my the war I was more interested in. I've done a lot more reading on World War One. So one of the
Mhm.
things I had to do for this book is I had to read a general history of the war in the Pacific, just looking at that, so that I had kind of an idea of large strategic things, personalities, those kind of things. And then I read the unit history, which was published by the Battery Press of the 41st Division.
Mhm.
And I went and I picked out all the parts that had to do with the 163rd, 2nd Battalion, Company G. And that gave me kind of a timeline of events.
Mhm.
And then I went through the writings of my uncle's interview, and then the writings of the other men, and the National Archives thing from Bruce Baird. And I gathered stories that went with the dates and the events and the areas of action, and tried to piece it all together so it made narrative sense.
Mhm.
And there was another book published. Oh, what's it called? So it's called From Poplar to Papua. It was published by a press in Montana, and I've forgotten the name of the author, but he's in the bibliography
Oh,
that wrote kind of like I want to say like a soldier's history of the 163rd. It
okay.
wasn't specific to Company G, but the 163rd. It was about them because that was the Montana National Guard regiment that was folded into the 41st.
Okay.
And that was a really good book. So it had a lot of good stories. Some stories that, are in the other books that involve, the people I'm writing about, and some just kind of general things about what the 163rd went through, not necessarily members of Company G, but sometimes.
Hmm.
And then I contacted the University of Montana, has the archives of one of the guys, Hargis Westerfield, and I was able to get all kinds of handwritten notes and papers and anything that he had in his files that I thought would interest me. And the best thing I found in there was the journal that the United States Army had captured or found this journal of a Japanese soldier who was
Yes.
fighting on Mindanao in the Philippines. And that was just, to me, that was the find of finds in terms of my research, because then I could present, kind of the Japanese point of view on what
Mhm.
was going on at the same time, at least in that one action, which I thought, in a way, there's kind of five soldiers who are in the book, and the fifth one
Right.
is the Japanese lieutenant. So,
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful find in an addition to the story because as you know, it comes later on in the book,
mhm.
but I was like, oh, that's perfect because at least you get like a counter uh, narrative just from the other side, what
Right,
it was like
right.
because a lot of these tales, well, you begin with the training that the men went through.
Mhm.
And then when they, and then you talk about Pearl Harbor and then the movements and how they all ended up in the 163rd Infantry
Mhm.
Regiment and in Company G. Um, but then as it gets into, they first head over to Australia, right? See, that's the
Right,
thing too about World War II history is like okay, I started with Civil War. I'm still a Civil War history buff.
right.
But then I got really interested in World War One and how the advances in the Civil War were kind of like a foreshadowing, like this is the way we're going with
Yeah,
warfare. Right.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I call World War One my gateway drug or whatever to World War Two. And
Yes.
I came to World War Two history, a lot later in life, but I find it fascinating. But and I have the European theater down pretty well. The
Hmm.
Pacific is just so, that theater was so vast, and then there's so many things about what we did over there that it just, there's so much to learn.
There is, and it's a lot. And I kind of made this point in the book a little bit. I think that, and I'm not in any way, if you read the book, you know I'm not saying we did things that we should be ashamed of, but to approach the things realistically,
Yeah.
that war was the war in the Pacific was ugly. There was no quarter
Mhm.
between the Japanese and the Americans or the Australians who were fighting in the places where my uncle fought. There wasn't a commonality of culture. There wasn't, each side had fairly awful racist ideas about the other side, which played themselves out in acts of cruelty and so, that is one of the things I wanted to bring out in the book. And one of the reasons why I was happy to have the story about from the Japanese soldier is it kind of helps humanize the other side. And I
Yeah.
think when we do look at World War II in the Pacific, oftentimes the Japanese are portrayed as these, vicious people. And it kind of plays into the stereotype I think that a lot of the World War II soldiers had. And I think we
Mhm.
need to move beyond that while acknowledging awful things took place on both sides, and that the Japanese, driven by their ideology
Mhm.
and their belief system, perpetrated some great crimes against humanity on a much larger scale, other than Hiroshima, than I think the United States did in
Yes.
Nagasaki. So,
And I thought you handled that like you just said. It was very balanced. Because it's undeniable that it was a conflict of cultures in many
right,
ways.
right,
Um, and I find that interesting. And I'll get into that as we go further into some of the questions.
okay,
And I'm wondering if I should maybe just go into that now. But yeah, well, you kind of start with the major the Sanananda front, right? I was
right.
like, how do you pronounce this?
That's how I say it. So,
Sanananda front. Company G was they were kind of landed in New Guinea, right?
yes, that's right.
And they were fighting to just to try to prevent a beachhead for Japan, who, at the time they still had hopes of invading maybe Australia or something like
Maybe, yeah,
maybe.
right,
Um, but but you mentioned something, and this comes later in the book about the natives in New Guinea that I
right,
had no idea about this, but the soldiers called the native peoples in New Guinea angels.
right.
And can you speak to that? And
Yeah.
was this news to you as well?
It was, and one of the things that, like you, I found it to be. I'm sorry, Peg. I gotta push my dog. Go
That's
on,
okay.
go on. Hey, you have to go on. Go on. In your
Wants to be
chair.
a Yeah, wants to be a part of the discussion.
Get in your chair, Zelda. Have you ever had a Great Dane?
No,
They
but
are they're so stubborn.
we have
Like
a
they're
Schnauzer, and Schnauzers are the same.
right. You think a Great Dane is stupid. They're not stupid. They just don't want to do what you want to do. Anyway, sorry. Let me get back to what I was trying to say.
No
So,
problem.
um, that was a big surprise to me too. It's not something I ever thought about, the presence of indigenous people in this place. And New Guinea is still home to people who still live fairly close to the indigenous way they lived before. And the jungles and the swamps of New Guinea are a really inhospitable place.
Mhm.
And early in the war, and Company G and the 163rd are sent to New Guinea in January of 1943. So,
Yeah.
we are really only a year in.
Hmm.
So early in the war, there were all kinds of things that American soldiers didn't have that they would later have because American manufacturing hadn't caught up to what soldiers needed. And so some units, like the 32nd Division, was rushed into New Guinea first, and then the 41st after them. Some of those units went into combat with essentially just the M1 and whatever they could carry on their backs. And one of the things they were missing were enough people to supply to work as porters, to carry things, and to act as medical personnel.
Hmm.
And what they found was that the indigenous people of New Guinea seemed really happy, and this is from the soldiers' point of view, to do those things for American soldiers, and that they were incredibly tender and caring nurses to
Yes.
wounded and sick American soldiers. And in part,
The picture
um,
there from the book.
right,
They're
in
holding a litter right there with a wounded.
Right. In part, that may have or what the Americans thought was it was because the Japanese had mistreated them. And there is some evidence of that taking place. And
Hmm.
so they were happy to help the Americans. One of the stories in there is that that the angels, if they were carrying an American on a litter, they had like 8 people carry one person, and they would carry
Yes.
in groups of 4, and then they would trade out, and they would do their best to carry them as smoothly as possible. But if they were asked to evacuate a wounded Japanese soldier, they'd just go off in the jungle somewhere and throw him out in the jungle and leave him to
Uh,
die. Now again, that's a story. That's a soldier story. We have to take it for what it is. But
yeah.
there, but the what is universal among I think all the people who I researched or who are in the book and who had interaction with these people is how wonderful they were to the sick and the wounded.
Mm.
That they were willing to act as porters, even though they had a tendency to throw stuff down and run away when the fighting started. Fair enough. But as nurses, they were excellent.
Wow.
So
Wow.
they
I found that the most that was like the area of comfort in the book. It's like, out of a, because the rest is obviously battles and fighting and dying and some ugly, ugly stuff.
yeah,
But when we came to the part on the angels, and then the how you wrote about, like you said, if there was uneven terrain and they would use their, you know,
like
hold it up
the
high to use like a spring mechanism so that
right,
they wouldn't, jostle someone who's wounded and make and give them more pain. And I was just
right.
like, oh, wow,
Yeah,
what wonderful human beings and
yep.
what a
They
message we
were.
can draw from them.
Yeah.
Um, well, thank you for touching on that. I just, again, it
Sure.
was like something I just completely new to me, and I love learning new things.
And it is a surprising note of humanity in an incredibly awful situation.
Yes,
And to,
thank you.
and to have it come from people who I think Americans, Japanese would not have thought.
Yep.
And it's probably why it made it so remarkable to them that they didn't hold those people in very high esteem, and then they were these wonderful people that they
Yep.
dealt with. So
Yep. So I just that was a really a wonderful moment of revelation. Um, Yes, and but so as we move further into the book, I mean, first of all, you've got some wonderful maps in here. Did a lot of these, I know a couple of them in the front where you had some help from some folks who kind of set up the maps, but were the
right.
rest from like National Archives or
Yes.
okay,
They all either from the National Archives or from the military history division.
okay.
Uh, and where I was able to find all of them just through, Wiki Commons and that don't have
Perfect.
a copyright
Okay.
on them. And anything all the photos are from the National Archives that aren't of my uncle are from the National Archives. And those are all, free use, essentially, which is great. And they have really great high resolution photos
Oh, they were
that you
wonderful.
can download pretty high res copies of. So I didn't have to go actually pay for copies of the photographs. I just downloaded them and sent them to the publisher.
That's great.
Yep.
That's great. Well, the other thing that jumped out to me in this book was, again, I knew this from other books I've read about the Pacific Theater. Obviously, the Pacific, the HBO miniseries have
Hmm.
that one was really visually gives you a sense of how horrible it was to fight in these tropical jungle locations. But that is a recurring, um, I don't want to say theme, but an aspect of the soldier experience. And as well as illness, that illness,
Yes.
like you mentioned, one of the men wasn't in the book for too long but everyone has gotten sick
Yes.
with dysentery, malaria. I mean, what a horrible place to fight.
Right. Every one of the 4 men in the book had malaria. At the
God.
very least, they had malaria. My uncle suffered with it for the rest of his life.
Oh
Uh,
my Lord.
so that was in one of his VA claims is a claim for malaria, for chronic malaria. So,
Yeah, and I didn't realize that malaria can affect you for the rest of your life,
mhm.
but that makes sense that it could,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, the conditions that these men fought in, harsh terrain. Like some of the photos that you have in here show them like I think it's towards when they were on Wakti, the island
Yes.
of am I pronouncing it right?
That's how
Wakti.
I say
Okay.
it.
And then also the island of Biak
I say Bayak, but
or
I'm from
Biak.
Texas, so we say a lot of hard we say I say Bayak, but I
Tomato,
don't. It probably is
tomato.
Biak. It probably is Biak.
Yes. And I mean, just here's one photo. It's
Right.
just it's almost vertical, and there's a cave in here, but they're just having to
Yeah.
climb hand over foot, and then it really drives home that God forbid you're wounded
Yes.
and no one can come get you. I mean, how do you it's just
Right.
horrible, horrible
Well,
fighting.
that was one of the conditions that early on in New Guinea, in the first time they went to New Guinea, Bruce Baird became ill while they were literally just out in the jungle. They were literally like, bushwhacking through jungle, and he became ill. And they essentially gave him the choice of staying and waiting for somebody to come evacuate him, or to just go on as sick as he was. And he chose just to go on because
Yeah.
he wasn't sure
Hmm.
that anybody would come get him. And that's another thing. They couldn't take the wounded forward with them, and there was no guarantee of how long it would take for somebody to come and get them. And even if they did take them, early in January, February of 43, there weren't even really hospital facilities on New Guinea for them to go to. So it was kind of a shoestring kind of operation, with just a lot of guys with relatively light weapons
Hmm. Hmm.
going through the jungle. And a lot of what they were doing was just trying to find pockets of Japanese soldiers and kill them so they couldn't be evacuated, so they couldn't move on to some other place and fight later. And so it's a real kind of a war of attrition
Yeah.
that's going on,
Hmm.
where, particularly on New Guinea, they're just trying to make sure Japanese soldiers don't escape from New Guinea and wind up somewhere else.
Yes.
That's a lot of what they were doing.
Right. Right. And it's like you said, the lack of like field hospitals. I mean, we take that for granted in the European theater.
Right.
Um, because at some point you can go far enough back from the front line to adequate medical facilities,
Right.
but that was never a
Yeah,
situation.
I
I
mean,
mean,
they everywhere they went, somebody had to build a road. If there was going to be a road, they had to build the road because there was no
yeah.
road.
So I
Uh,
just think the guys that got pulled the ticket for going to the Pacific Theater, I have, I mean, I really think they had it so much. I mean, all of it was horrible,
right.
but I just think that, gosh, going to the Pacific Theater presented its own unique set
It
of,
did. The scale certainly is smaller.
yeah,
And I think in lots of ways that meant the fighting and the killing was more intimate in the sense that
yes.
you saw these people and you saw their bodies a week later because nobody came to get them or bury them. This kind of stuff
Mm,
uh, happened in a way which I'm not sure in the European theater, which to me always felt like more about movement.
yeah,
And this is more about just grinding away at the enemy until they're all gone.
yeah.
Is what it felt like and what it feels like to me in reading about it.
Hmm. Hmm. And that kind of comes forward. We see the results of that feeling of just, seeing your dead buddies or seeing it kind of increased the rancor,
Right.
against
Yes.
the enemy. And that came across in the what you call the hospital fight. It was
Right.
let me see if I can find the page number on that one. But that's where we kind of see the no holds, like take no prisoners. And
Right.
you point out the fact that at the time, when these guys first went over there, they learned really quickly that even if you think a Japanese soldier is surrendering, a lot of times, in their culture, that is shameful.
Right.
You don't
Right.
surrender. It's better to be dead than surrender. So
Right.
a lot of these guys would booby trap themselves or
Mhm.
try to take out as many American GIs as they could. So
Right.
you want to talk about that hospital fight and what happened there? And
Sure. So the hospital fight takes place as a part of the first action that Company G, the 163rd, are involved in New Guinea, as you were saying earlier, the fight along the Sandananda Road and the adjacent paths through the jungle. And 2nd Battalion Company G of the 163rd, which Company G is a part of, one of their jobs was essentially they would do kind of, I'm going to use a football term, like end runs. They would go out through the jungle and then come back so they could find their way behind an enemy position
Mhm.
along the road or in the jungle. So on one of these kind of treks through the jungle, they came across a clearing where there was a hospital. It was marked as a hospital, and there were huts, some up on stilts, several several buildings, for lack of a better way of describing them. But it was marked as a hospital. So, when the scouts come out, when the people who are in the lead, and I believe it was third platoon of Company G steps out into the clearing, they start taking gunfire, machine gun fire, mortar fire, and other kind of small arms fire. And at that point, Company G and Second Battalion commander said, "Okay, that's it. It's on.
Yeah.
Hospital or no, we're not gonna we can't go around it. We have to take care of it." And so they ended up fighting their way through this hospital. And as they went through the hospital, they found Japanese soldiers who were barely alive, who had booby trapped themselves, and would literally just put a hand grenade in their armpit and then just move their arm as Americans came by
Mm.
and try to blow them up. So they just shot, killed every Japanese soldier, that they
Wounded or
found.
not, they
Yep,
were.
they didn't take time to try to figure it out. And one of the things I think is interesting about that is that the three of the soldiers participated in it. If you take my uncle's point of view, his point of view is, we did what we had to do.
Right.
They broke the rules. They were doing it, and then we had to do this. Take Jack Anderson's point of view, his is all technical. This is how we did it, and this is what happened. You take Bruce Baird's point of view, and he feels, I can almost sense in what he wrote about it, that that he felt uncomfortable. Not that he thought what Americans did was wrong, but that he was uncomfortable with the way things had to be,
Hmm.
in a way which I think my uncle adapted to maybe more quickly than
Hmm.
he did. Now that may be hindsight. My uncle's more hardened attitude might be because he was in the war up until 1945, up until June of 1945,
Right.
and Baird goes home in 1944, and so maybe that's true.
Yeah.
Uh, and maybe that explains their attitude. But there, it was definitely something I think probably gave some soldiers pause about. One of the first things they did where they felt this is not normal. This isn't just war. This is something different. And I think that it impacted a lot of them in that way, either
Hmm.
making hardening them more or creating a sense of doubt about just a little bit maybe about why things were the way they were.
Yeah.
If you read when you read the book, you'll find that Baird is the one always talking about, oh, and then we figured out that these were not Japanese soldiers, they were Korean, so
Oh,
we stopped killing them. And you don't get that from my uncle, and you don't get that from Jack
yeah.
Anderson or from
Yeah.
Harvest Westerfield. You don't get that same. Baird seems to be and I don't mean to make him sound sensitive in a way it makes him sound weak or not as tough as the others, but it seemed to bother him more. Maybe, I don't know exactly why, but
Hmm.
maybe
He wanted
he
to
just felt more remorse.
more remorse, the
Yeah,
fact that he's taking more time to maybe discern the differences,
maybe.
like
Yeah,
between the Japanese and if Koreans were kind of,
right,
uh, taken in and forced to work for the
right.
Japanese, that kind of
Yes,
stuff. Kind of like in the European theater where like Polish people were, the Nazis kind of rounded them up and forced them to fight and they didn't want
right.
to.
Yep, yep.
Um, right.
Well, that's
So I guess I just like to kind of close with throughout all of your research, Brian, was there anything you found surprising or anything that you think you might want to follow up on or learn more about?
Something I found surprising, I think, and you kind of touched on this earlier, was, the variety of geography across which the men of the Pacific fought. There, a lot of it is in jungle. There is some on like coral islands and cliffs and things like that. And then, they actually fought in the Philippines. They fought their way through a city in the Philippines and
Yes.
came across, missionaries and missions and their interaction with indigenous people, like we were talking about the Angels, but also Filipino people in the Philippines and the Moro people on the island of Jolo in the Sulu archipelago. And that was something I had not considered is how much interaction, you know, we were talking about the difference between the European theater and the Pacific. We know in the Pacific they were going to come across people,
Yeah.
but for some reason in the Pacific it had not occurred to me that that would happen,
Mhm.
and that they would be able to use the people as a resource in all kinds of ways. And that part of what they did was, at various points, actually going out and looking for indigenous people who had been cut off or who had been in some other way attacked, terrorized, imprisoned by the Japanese, and then, working with those people to gain information, to, that kind of thing. So a lot more of that than I thought.
Mhm.
There were, but that definitely surprised me. In terms of researching or more stuff I'd want to learn, I really think it's fascinating the point of view of Japanese soldiers. So, if I could just even without the idea of writing about it, I would love to read more diaries and books of Japanese soldiers describing their experiences. I'm not sure a lot of them did that after World War II. I would be surprised if they did. But
Yeah.
more things like these diaries that were captured by, U.S. Military intelligence and that are archived somewhere. I just found that to be really fascinating.
Well, and I'm sure there's a lot more than we think, but they're just untranslated, right?
Yeah. Well, that was, that was the other thing I I hadn't thought about until I read that. It was that the U.S. Army had Japanese translators moving with its military units to decode and translate all these things and
Yes.
see if they were of any military use whatsoever.
Yes. Oh, and that just reminds me of a book I read a few years ago, and I wrote a review on it, but it was about the Japanese Americans who fought
Hmm.
for America, and oh, that was a wonderful book. If I can remember the name, I'll share that with you.
Okay.
But it was, yes, they would translate. They would use them to, to call out for the troops to surrender or the
Right.
Japanese soldiers.
Hmm.
And but boy, and they had to put up with racism too within the
Yeah.
ranks. I mean, and
Absolutely.
people
Yeah.
doubting their loyalty, to the
Yes.
United States, even though they're,
While their families were in,
oh, and
camps back in the United States.
yes,
Yeah.
it's so shameful, a
Yep.
very shameful part of our history there. I'll tell you one other thing that really surprised me because after reading about all of this terrain that was just so nightmarish, there was a tank battle. The first,
There
what is it?
was.
The first, one of the few tank battles of the war in the Pacific, and this is of a Japanese tank. And
Yep.
see, they didn't really have great tactics. They didn't really how to know how to use it because they just went straight line. So our
Yeah.
guys were just like boom, boom.
Yeah. Well, and my uncle kind of touched on that he thought the Japanese were poor soldiers because they didn't they because they since they didn't fear death because that they thought that was honorable,
Yeah,
they just kept doing the same thing over and over again. And you think about when you think about the Japanese overwhelming all those places in the early days of World War II, they just did it by sheer numbers and being on attack mode all the time. And one of the things I think that helps the United States is they weren't very good at defensive fighting. They could set up the positions, but every once in a while they just go, okay, let's just go attack them.
yeah,
And they would,
yeah,
and then they would experience, high casualty events
yes.
when that took place. And that tank battle is a good example
Mm.
of exactly, how that worked out.
Like, oh my Lord.
A
Yeah, I
lot
didn't
of fighting
even,
spirit, not a lot of tactics.
not exactly
Yeah.
an overabundance of fighting spirit that
Mhm.
wasn't kind of reined in with smart,
Right. Yeah.
tactical movement. And I didn't even know that the Japanese had tanks
Yep.
in these places. I was like, wow.
Yep.
Um, yeah, but fascinating.
Yeah, that's one of the other things about the book that I hope comes through is that one of the things that happens over time is the American advantage in terms of equipment and coordination builds up to be this kind of unstoppable military force. The soldiers still had to go through it, and men still died, and horrible things still happened.
Mhm.
But at some point, the weight of all the United States' ability to manufacture and to put in the hands of their soldiers better weapons, new weapons, more food, tanks, planes, coordination with Navy, Air Force, and infantry soldiers on the ground. That just became unstoppable.
Yep.
And I think you see that in the book in the part where Company G is fighting in the Philippines, where they're coordinating with all these other groups and getting things
Yes.
done.
It was amazing to me. And this is why I think these type of small unit histories are so important because we can read these overarching histories, World War II, the big battles, but this really
Mhm.
gets down to the nuts and bolts of how they happened,
Right,
and how did these different units, um, interact with each other. And I think, and you laid it out so clearly because it can be overwhelming for the
mhm.
neophyte to kind of understand, the hierarchy,
Right.
you know.
That took me a
Um,
long time to
yeah.
get right, by the way.
Yes, you kind
And
of
I
need to
hope I
have a
did get it
chart.
right.
Like here's a division, and underneath the division is, was it
Right.
the regiment, and then the battalion, and then the platoon, and then the
Yeah.
company. Um,
It's the battalion, company, platoon organization that throws me the most, particularly the platoons, because and that's where I kind of like wasn't always able to keep track of who was in what platoon.
yeah,
So
it can be mind-boggling.
yeah.
But how they would rotate too was interesting
Mhm.
between like the
Yeah.
162nd, with was it the 186th? Was that the
Yes.
third one? Okay, and then they would kind of support each other. So two would
Mhm.
go in. one would stay in reserve. If things got dicey, they could bring in the third one. So,
Right. Yep.
um,
That's
and,
absolutely how MacArthur used them.
yeah,
And as they got better, he could trust them to do more things on their own and
yeah.
to work together when they had to. So
Well,
one of
I'd
the
love,
things,
oh,
sorry.
go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the other things I think about the war in the Pacific that we don't think about is since there aren't, with the exception of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where we can see these huge casualty numbers that take place in a short period of time. I think a lot of what I didn't know and the misconception I had was that, oh yeah, there were small battles and a few people were hurt and so, but these were small battles that took place every day. So on the first day of combat, when Company G goes into combat, I believe 7 members of Company G are killed on day one.
Mm.
And when you put that in perspective of a military unit of around 150 people, you're talking about, 7 people wounded, 10 people have casualties. You're over 10% casualties in
Hmm.
one day. And that's not taking into account disease
Yeah,
or accidents or other, that's just literal battle casualties. And then that happens every day. Because it's not fight a big battle and then, the other side goes away.
yeah,
It's you fight a small battle and then there's another one the next day and then they attack you the next, and it's just on and on. And so, one of the things that I'm sorry, I'm off on a tangent now.
no,
But one of the things that struck me is one of the things I did was I was able to find the casualty list for the whole 41st Division and all the regiments, and for each one of the battles, just scroll through that, and to scroll through, you know, hundreds and hundreds of names. Not necessarily all soldiers being killed, of course, but
yeah,
wounded soldiers and soldiers killed and soldiers missing. You really, I think, gained a much greater appreciation for kind of the nightmarish quality of what was going on
hmm
because it was every day.
every
Uh,
day.
and
Just the attrition and then the psychological
yes.
uh, drain and
Hmm.
strain. I can only imagine the PTSD a lot of these the ones who survived must have,
Right.
maybe, and like maybe with your great uncle maybe quietly dealt with, or
Yeah.
but it had to have been there.
Yeah, there has to have been something. I think he and his wife, my Aunt Helen, were incredibly wonderful people. And my guess is that he leaned on her when that happened. And then his outward face was what he was.
Hmm.
But then I have a feeling he was a lot more tender when he was by him, when it was just the two of them.
Oh,
But they were wonderful people.
well, that's outstanding. Well, it comes through in the book as just for the rest of us out there. But I got to know your great Uncle Doyle and his sacrifices for the country and for the world, fighting part of the Allied forces. I really just I appreciate these type of books, and this was just so well written,
Well, thank you again,
Brian.
Peggy.
I really
Appreciate
enjoyed this, and I just recommend it to all of our viewers out there who have an interest in World War II history, particularly small unit history, that is accessible, and
it. Right.
it's not overburdened with military jargon and all this stuff. It's very accessible.
I, I'm glad
Yeah,
to hear that.
yes,
Very glad to hear
absolutely.
that.
I'll be looking for your first book too. But do you have any plans for anything else? Do you have any
Uh, I
projects?
I have plans. I've been telling people, and this is true. My wife and I are writing a mystery novel together. So we have the first draft of that, and we just started doing the edits on that. So that's been really fun. I do have other history projects in mind. Probably another American World War One soldier who was a Marine, who was in the Sixth Marine Regiment, whose papers are located kind of close to where I live, so I would have pretty easy access to his archive. And I think he might. I think I would like to write something about him because he's a really interesting person. But so I have projects. If I
Project.
it takes me so long to write a book though, who knows how many of them I'll ever get to. So
Yes, well, and that's the other thing I forgot to ask you. How long did it take you to put together MacArthur's Bloody Butchers?
so I think I got the idea for writing it in the same year that my first book came out, which I think was 2008. So the idea, I
Oh,
saw the tape. My dad shared the tape with me in 2008. I talked to my Aunt Helen because she was still alive at that time. I want to say that year or the next year around Christmas time. And I got the idea to start writing it then. And then, I kind of pursued it off and on. It was very discouraging sometimes because I thought there's no way there's a book in this. There's no way there's
Hmm.
a whole book. And I know you're not supposed to be that way when you're a writer, but the truth of the matter is if I'm going to spend time writing, I want to publish it. I want it to be read.
That's right.
Uh, and uh,
Hmm.
and so it took me a while. So 2008 till what 2024 is 16 years.
16 years.
But
Okay.
not 16 years of hard labor. I mean like 16 years of I work on it for 2 months and then I
Yeah.
don't and that kind of thing. So
Gotcha. I
yeah.
gotcha. And while I have you, I just realized one of my questions I wanted to ask, I forgot to ask as well, but the title of the book, we should explain.
Oh yeah.
Let's circle back to the hospital fight.
Okay.
MacArthur's Bloody Butchers. You mentioned like after that fight, and when the American GIs just went in and cleaned house and said, we're
Mhm.
not designating, we're just taking everyone out.
Right.
The Tokyo Rose, right?
Yes.
Ended up calling them bloody butchers for that act.
Yep. She
But
she sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, but the men kind of said, you know what? We kind of like that, and we'll just make a slight variation on it. Can you speak to how their name came out,
Yeah.
came about?
So they were in reserve, I think, at the time. I believe they're part of the combat and New Guinea had come to an end, but they were still in New Guinea. So they would be like in a reserve position, a rest position, because anyway. So and they were just listening to the radio and Tokyo Rose because that's what they listened to because she played, American music and stuff like that, and then the propaganda in between. And she came on and basically just called them out for killing all these, wounded men and doing this terrible thing. And she called them the Bloody Butchers of San Ananda. That's what she called them.
Oh, yes.
And so
Okay.
they adopted the name Bloody Butchers. They started calling themselves Bloody Butchers, and then that became
That
MacArthur's Bloody Butchers.
MacArthur's Bloody
It,
Butchers. Yeah.
interestingly, the nickname was so popular that it spread from just Second Battalion of the 163rd, who were technically the people
Okay.
involved in the hospital fight, to the whole 163rd, and then other units said, "Hey, that's a really cool nickname," because the 41st other nicknames were not as cool. They were called the Jungleers.
Oh, the Jungleers. Yes.
Yeah, which is that's the division. Technically, I think it's a division nickname. Sometimes they were called the Sunset Division because the patch
Yes.
looked like a setting sun.
Hmm.
The second battalion's nickname before Bloody Butchers was Racers. They were named after the lieutenant colonel who was their battalion leaders, and they
Right.
moved fast through the jungle, so they were called the Racers. And I think they really liked Bloody
Yeah,
Butchers better.
that's right. You gotta instill some fear in your nickname.
Yeah.
The Jungleers kind of sounds like maybe like a Boy Scout troop or something.
Yep, that's the way it's always kind of sounded to me too.
And so
That's the
that's
way
where
it's
we
always
have the
sounded.
title, MacArthur's Bloody Butchers, Company G, 163rd Infantry Regiment in the Pacific War. I'm telling you guys, it is a great book. And thanks, Brian. And congratulations again. I have
Oh,
to say, out of the thousands of booktubers out there, there's a very small handful that actually, write and publish books. And so that's got to be, quite a feat. And you must feel and I'm sure your family just, must love the fact that you've got this published.
yep. It was a something I dedicated to my dad who died a few years ago. So he
Yeah.
didn't see it published. We did see it in manuscript form.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very pleased with it. Pleased that Casemate published it. By the way, the title was my idea, not their idea. I don't want to make
Oh,
it sound like they saddled me with the title. I'm the one who came up with the title. So
okay. No, I got it. A little inside baseball there on
yeah,
that. That was your title.
yep.
At the publishers. Well, what a
That's what
wonderful
I sent to him.
testament to your great uncle and the rest of your family and your father. And I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot.
Thank,
So thank you so much.
thank you.
And thanks for
Thank you.
joining us today here on the History Shelf. So until next time, everybody, thanks for joining us and check out Brian's book. Thanks again, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.